What's up, buddy? This is JTech95 back for another video. Today we got a special guest with us. This is my buddy Mike from Calculate. I've talked to you guys about him before. He's helped me an awful lot with getting a lot of these machines working. And today we're going to be doing some comparisons between 486 processors. But before we start, Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I've been working with computers since the early 90s, so I've been very active in the retro communities and playing with the old hardware and learning more about it every day. So got years and years of experience, and I love talking about it and sharing what I know.
Awesome. Yep. He has some great videos on his channel. Go check that out. I'm going to put a link in the description down there. But anyway, as for the video today, I brought him along for not only his expertise, but also for his, his take on, what the differences between processors are. So I guess to start out, we should show you what we're going to be working with. So we got 4 processors. Originally, I was just going to do 2, but I figured, just to change it up a little bit, we're going to compare 4. And all 4 of them have something in common. The first 2 here, we've got a 486DX25, and we've got a 486SX25. And over here, Mike's got...
We've got a DX250 and an SX250. The SX2 is a new one to me. I didn't see that one until recently, so it's definitely an interesting one to look at. So
yeah, I didn't know it existed until you mentioned it to me. I was like, really? They made an SX2?
Yeah.
That's different. And I heard that they made an SX266 as well.
I've not even seen that one.
I haven't either. And shoot, I just found out there's a DX240.
Yeah, that one blows my mind too.
Yeah, it had to have been slow, but someday if I find one, I'll do a video about that. But anyway, we're going to talk about what the differences between an SX and a DX are. We're going to do some benchmarks in DOS and in Windows. We're going to see what these chips are made of. So sit back and hang tight, and we're going to do some benchmarks this time on JTech95. Thank you for tuning back into JTech95. As I said before, is my buddy Mike from Calculate, and he's going to be in this video too. We're going to be comparing some processors. So we'll start with the 2 basic ones. We got the 486DX and the 486SX. Basically, the main difference between the 2 is that the DX processor has a built-in math coprocessor, whereas the SX did not. What's your take on, other than that, anything else that's different?
Unlike the 386 platform, SX and DX only dictated the bit width of the data bus, where the SX was 16-bit, DX was 32-bit. On the 486, all of them are 32-bit, and now the SX means it does not have a math coprocessor, and the DX does. So
okay.
A little bit different from Intel.
Yeah. And a lot of people I've heard say, oh, a DX is a lot faster than an SX. Well, that's up for debate, and we're going to find out if that's actually true in our benchmarks today. The other 2 processors we got here that Mike showed earlier is the DX250 and the SX250. My previous video, I had mentioned that a DX2, like a DX266, is a double-clocked DX33. Well, it's the same concept here. The DX250 is a double-clocked DX25. The SX2 is a double-clocked SX25.
I don't think we've mentioned yet, all 4 of these processors run at a 25 megahertz frontside bus. Mm-hmm. So this will also be a comparison of how the clock doubling affects your benchmarks.
Yeah, and that's the that was the point that I had made in the beginning, that there's one thing in common between all 4 of these chips, besides the fact they're all 486s, the fact that they all run at the same bus speed, 25 megahertz. So let's show you really quick the board that we're going to be working with, and what we're going to be running alongside these chips. So this is the motherboard we're going to be using for the benchmarks. One, it was the one I had laying around at the moment, and two, it just got finished being repaired. Mike actually repaired it for me. Had several issues going on with it that Mike can explain a little better what was wrong.
Yeah, this one threw me for a loop for a little while because it had some bad traces that I didn't notice initially, and it had me chasing some red herrings and pulling parts that didn't need it necessarily, and just kind of scratching my head for a while. But eventually we powered through and got it figured out, and it seems to be running good.
Yep, it's kind of an oddball board too. We've never seen one like this. It's the brand on it. It is a KMC 48625. And after some research, didn't we find that KMC was a Jamicon?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Kind of a little bit inconclusive if it's really it was a Jamicon or something like that.
Yeah.
Or if it was its own thing, because the Jamicon name is a Japanese company, but this was made in America, so who really knows where it came from?
Yep. Might have been an American division of the company, perhaps.
Could be, yeah.
But this board, it has an Opti 82C 481/482 chipset with the 82C 206 chip here. 8 megabytes of RAM. The BIOS chip, just like that 386 I've got, and I showed a previous video, it's got Mr. BIOS, which again is a version of a BIOS by Microid Research. They're really interesting to look up their history if you want to look up their history at some point. And 128K of level 2 cache, kind of slow, it's 25 nanoseconds. And the video card we're going to be using is an Orchid ProDesigner 2 with a Tseng ET4000 with 1 meg of RAM on board. So let's get this thing set up with the first processor, and we'll see what kind of results we get. So starting out the benchmarks here, we're going to be taking a look at the 486SX25 here with check CPU, landmark, and speed sys. So we can see here that the SX25 gets a score of 9.03 for the processor. And over here on the right we can see the L1, L2, and memory throughput scales. So not the greatest, but that's to be considered for what kind of processor it is. So let's move forward to the next one. What's your input on what you think the 486DX and SX25s are going to be in terms of what their differences are?
Well, the CPU score should be identical. Video throughput shouldn't change. Where you will see the differences in that FPU benchmark, which tests exclusively the floating point unit. So obviously, since we don't have one, we don't have a score on this SX.
Yep. As you can see here in landmark, there is no score for the FPU because, like you said, the SX processor simply did not have one. Now, did the SX processors come from Intel purposely without one to meet needs of people who just might not need one to cut costs? Or was it a processor that maybe failed the test of the math coprocessor or just didn't make the mark in general?
I think a lot of the SX chips did fail validation on the coprocessor, so they just disabled that. And it's hard to say if they took known good chips and still disabled it because they needed more processors to fill the market. No one really knows what Intel did.
Then looking over here at the speed sys for the DX25, we see that the memory numbers did not change, but the processor margin did, just slightly, up to 9.27.
Yeah, that tells us that SpeedSys must be accounting for the math coprocessor to some degree. And we also can see that because the memory throughput didn't change at all, that we're being limited by that 25 megahertz frontside bus, and your clock speed really has nothing to do with that.
And we'll move up here to the landmark for the DX25, and as you can see here, the CPU may not have changed, but the elephant in the room is that there is actually a floating point unit score here of 188.62, which, you know, that designates that there is a floating point unit in this processor, given that it is a DX. You can even see here it's an Intel 487DX. Let's move on here to the DX250, which, as Mike had pointed out earlier, is a double-clocked 25 megahertz DX.
Yeah, we can see our CPU score jumped up to 18.47, which
it's about double.
Yeah, right about double. That's about what you would expect. The memory scores did improve. Not a whole lot, but any improvement does make a big difference on the 486 and slower platforms, because your laws of diminishing returns, the faster and faster things get, the lower the difference in performance you see. So here at these very low clock speeds, even 1 megahertz can make a noticeable difference in certain situations.
And here for the landmark for that processor, we see quite a noticeable difference from the DX and SX25s, whereas the SX and DX25s got a score of 118.64 and 0.65 respectively. The DX250 gets a score of 237.19, which is, again, is about double. Same with the floating point unit from the DX25.
So we know we've got a chipset that thoroughly supports both of these processors. It's running them for all that they're worth, and we're getting all the performance that we can hope to get from them.
And for the final processor here, we have the SX250. This is a new one for both of us, as was stated earlier. And we can see here that it's slightly lower than the DX250. Instead of 18.47 for the CPU score, we get an 18.04, which, as Mike had stated earlier, shows that SpeedSys can see there's a slight difference between the two processors, given that the one has a math coprocessor built in. But we can also see that the memory timings really didn't change at all.
Yeah, compared to the DX2, it's identical. That's what we would expect. So.
And looking here at the landmark for the SX250, again, kind of strange, it's showing up as a DX, but I digress. Again, we see CPU score is 0.01 less than the DX250. But, again, there is no floating point unit, designating it is an SX processor. So let's really quick take a look at the 3D bench for these four processors, and we'll start out with the SX25. Already we can see it's pretty sluggish from the get-go.
Yeah, that 25 megahertz really holds it back, both from a raw horsepower standpoint and the fact it's inhibiting potential throughput between the processor and the memory on the board, because that runs over your data bus.
And if we look over here at the final score, we get a 16.3, which is pretty bad. So let's move on to what we got for the DX25. And as we can see, it didn't do any better. It got the same score of a 16.3, which again denotes the fact that an SX and a DX, or a DX processor, is not going to help you when it comes to things like games, because it's not what the point of it was. A math coprocessor, as much as some people would like to say it would, a math coprocessor will not help with games like Doom or Duke Nukem or Wolfenstein or anything, because that's not what it was made for.
Correct. I think Quake was the first game to use a math coprocessor, and these processors have no chance of even trying to run that game, so it's really a moot point.
Yep, we're not even going to try to run Quake on these machines because I'm sure we all know what the output would be. Garbage. So moving up here, you can see on the screen we're looking at the benchmarks for 3D Bench for the SX250. It is a little bit faster. I can see a little bit more smoothness. And we end up with a score of 23.6, which still not the greatest, but it definitely is an upgrade from the 25 megahertz processors.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that we're not seeing double performance between the DX and the DX2, for example. This is largely due to now, instead of just testing the processor alone, these games are relying on the memory throughput, which isn't going to increase much at all just by doubling your CPU clock, because again, you're still at 25 megahertz between the processor and RAM, and you can only squeeze so much out of that. So that's why you don't get double performance by doubling your clock speed.
And over here looking, as we switch over to the DX250 from the SX250, just like we saw between the SX25 and DX25, there is no difference between the SX2 and the DX2. Again, like I said, it has, your game performance has nothing to do with what your clock speed, or whether or not you have a math coprocessor. It has to do with a multitude of things. The power of your graphics card and the power of your CPU, the main processor, not the math coprocessor. So here's the graph here showing the full scope of what the differences are between Check CPU, Landmark, and SpeedSys for the 4 processors. As you can see, the DX and SX25s were maintained just about the same, as did the SX250 and DX250. And here's the full graph for the cache and FPU speeds. As you can see, there's 0 for the FPU for both the SX and SX2 processors, and there are scores for it for the DX. Like I said, the DX processors had a math coprocessor and the SXs didn't. But overall, just like in the previous graph, the SX and DX25s maintained about the same, with the exception of the floating point unit, and the SX2 and DX2 maintained roughly the same, with the exception of the floating point unit. Then let's load up Microsoft Windows version 3.1 and take a look at this benchmark here. It's called WinSpeed version 1.0. For the SX25 and the DX25, we get the same CPU win mark of 190. And we move forward to the DX2 and SX250s. They both get a score of 378. Which, after looking at all these benchmarks between DOS and Windows, it's very safe to conclude that unless you're working with programs that are reliant on a math coprocessor, such as CAD programs and whatnot, a SX processor, in a lot of respects, isn't that much of a downgrade from a DX.
Right, especially during this time period, most applications just were not written to take advantage of a math processor. So unless you were doing something like heavily computational with math, like spreadsheets or CAD programs, there just wasn't any gains to be had. It's not going to draw windows on your screen any faster. It's not going to help your DOS games. It just, at that time period, did not do a whole lot for you.
We also took the liberty of doing some benchmarks of Doom on all 4 processors, just to see if the differences of processors made any difference on the playability. And as you can see here on the graph, just like with the previous tests, the SX25 and DX25 got the same score of 9.9 FPS, and the SX2 and the DX2 got the same score of 16.8. You can also see the 3D Bench scores here too, just so you could see them in a graph form. So there you have it, folks, the differences between the SX and DX 486 processors. Yeah, really between the SX and DXs, aside from the fact that DX had a floating point unit, the SXs didn't, there was really no difference between the two processors.
Yeah, it's eye-opening even today, because I was thinking back to when I got my first computer that I could call my own. It was a compact Presario 486 SX33, and shortly after I got it, I upgraded it to a DX266, and back then that was the processor to have if you had a 486. But it wasn't clear to me then that just having the DX2 specifically wasn't that big of a benefit in the end. If I just stayed with the SX, it would have been pretty good for most of the things I did.
So it's kind of on topic but off topic question, just out of curiosity. So this question for you, Mike. So the 48625, I know that the 486 processors had substantially more transistors inside than the previous models, the 386s.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been a lot of people online asking, is there such a thing as a 386 processor that is faster than a 486? Or does it all boil down to the fact that a 486 is just faster than a 386 because of how it's built?
Well, there's an awful lot of variables that come into play here, because when you're talking about, for example, Doom performance, every aspect of your system plays into what kind of score you're going to get there. So it boils down to which video card you have, which chipset you have, which cache you have, if you even have cache. A lot of 386s and budget 486s didn't even have cache. So I know that there are some motherboards that have CPU sockets for both a 386 and a 486. If you wanted to do a true comparison, you would need one of those motherboards so that you could keep all the variables isolated, and the only differences you're checking then are the processors themselves.
Kind of like that video that Necroware did about that board that had VESA local bus on it, and they had sockets for a 386 and a 486, and he did a bench between the two. Yep.
I haven't seen much direct comparison between a 386 and a 486, so it's entirely possible that, for example, a 386 DX40 could beat a low-end 486 25 megahertz. It would be fun to see.
Mm-hmm. And that would honestly be a good little video for a future episode.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you all so much for watching the video. Comment on what you thought of the video in the comment section down there, as long as YouTube didn't move it again. Like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. And I want to thank my buddy Mike here from Calculate for co-starring in this video, sharing his insight into retro computing. And like I said, check out his channel. He's got some fantastic content on there. I'll put a link in the description below. And yeah, so thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Catch you later. Bye-bye.